Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development, and the 75th anniversary of the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. It really is fitting that we do so by dedicating this afternoon to examining China's one-child policy, its evolution, implementation, conclusion, and its implications for the future. I'm Jeanette Takamura, professor at Columbia University and also Dean Emerita. One of the most significant social policies to emerge in the 20th century, the one-child policy aimed to stem the burgeoning growth of China's population. All of this to enable a nation transformed. I'm standing in today for Columbia China Center for Social Policy's visionary founding director, Professor Jin Gao, who is in very high demand and could not be at her own event. As you no doubt know, the China Center advances comparative international social policy research, education, and innovative multidisciplinary initiatives. Its collaborations with major universities, think tanks, and organizations in the global community have been both productive and impactful. Embedded in China's constitution in 1982, the one-child policy was propelled by mounting concerns about overpopulation posing a threat to the nation's fiscal and other resources and capacities. Here, all of our exceptional panelists have important contributions. Throughout her career, Judith Bruce, long in leadership roles at the Population Council, has reminded us, and it's so relevant today, that discussions such as today's cannot lose sight of women, the impact of birth control and reproductive health policy on them, the girl child, and marriage in developing countries. Joan Kaufman, Senior Director of the Schwarzman Scholars, has similarly applied a gender and reproductive health lens to much of her work in her impressive China-focused career. Professor Yong recognized the gender dimensions and implications of the one-child policy in his observations, which I appreciated, of China's missing girls and women. He, of course, has argued that the decline in fertility had begun prior to the one-child policy, attributable in part to structural changes in the then emergent social environment and including embedded cultural forces in China. Given the illustrious panelists assembled here today, we arguably have an abundance of intellectual riches, perspectives, and opportunities for the exploration, analysis, and discussion of the development, implementation, impact, and lessons learned from a policy which had a relatively short run of 34 years. We look to Professor Gu Baochang, an iconic force in the ICPD and in demography studies, for his insights on policy reforms that led to the end of the one-child policy. And we are fortunate indeed to have Professor Feng, renowned for multiple award-winning books on China's historical transformation, to examine China's demographics and their implications post-one-child policy, along with Professor Yong, who I mentioned earlier. It occurred to me last night that I have known and appreciated the work of some of the panelists for nearly 40 years. Yes, I'm that young. Based on this, I would venture to suggest that the discussions begun here will continue in interactions and in conversations stimulated well beyond today. Before we hear from the panelists, we thank the Weatherhead East Asia Institute and the Columbia Population Research Center for their co-sponsorship with the Columbia China Center for Social Policy for today's commemorative program. Each of our exceptional speakers will be providing a 15-minute presentation. After all have spoken, your questions and engagement with the panel from the floor and so many of you on Zoom are most welcome. Because there is much ground to cover, we will be rather strict observing time provisions for the speakers. Leading off today in an order determined by the panelists is Judith Bruce on the global shift to women's rights and health in the ICPD. And I would say that this is an incredibly relevant topic. With that, as Fareed Zakaria would say, let us begin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put the microphone here because I tend to use my hands when I speak. This is a very exciting and, thank you, dear, sentimental moment. And I'm going to try to do briefly is this, kind of paint the landscape as it evolved towards the cross-national effort to end the one-child policy. So I'm going to speak about the more global situation and background paradigms, but obviously China catalyzed many of the discussions, and the implications for China, my other panelists will draw it in much more detail. First of all, I've been with the Population Council for almost 50 years, a long, long time. I was at the first Women's Conference, which was a stunning event. The council was founded in 1952, and the reason I bring this up is that around 1952, there were two things that are background, I think, assumptions that shaped thinking since that time. The first was that the council was founded as the Population Council at the same time that the Agricultural Development Council was funded, with the idea that population was not on its own an issue, but in relation to resources and the generation of inequities and scarcities. That was the original impulse. But what happened in the public discourse was, I'm gonna use my hands now, so you have population growth and resources. Suddenly, the resources piece just goes away, and now you have population growth as a sole topic. It's focused entirely on fertility, on female fertility, on specific organs of females, literally. And to the point where in 1980, the sort of first monograph I was involved in, 97% of the contraceptive development funds were tinkering with the female system, mainly the endocrine system. Now that's linked to the other thought we have to keep in mind, the vaccine. I was the first generation vaccinated against polio, and the belief that there would be a one and done solution, and it was a marvel. So the implications of something that was simple, that you had a compliant population and that they had a disease or could be prevented from having a disease, was back there lurking at pretty much at all times, and still is with us. Now, there was a raging debate from 52 and really intensifying in the early 70s between North and South and progressives and others about whether the, quote, solution to the population growth problem, remember, disconnected from this other problem of generation of meaningful resources and their distribution, of whether you used services and contraception or development and demand. That debate was finally dealt with, at least publicly and very controversially, in the 1974 Bucharest conference, where John Rockefeller stood up, and he was very identified, and it was a different world. Individual philanthropists of his stature had a tremendous impact, said, we're on the wrong track. We're not listening to the people of the South, we're not listening to women. We've gotten sidelined. We're focused on the technology alone. This was meant to be a humanistic mission. Let us return to that. Now I'm going to speed walk through some of the, and you'll, I know, remind me on time, some of the, I think, important contributions of the ICPD and the Beijing Women's Conference as they consolidated and clarified, or at least help people clarify their positions. It didn't lead always to consensus, but it began to make this a less cloudy discussion. The International Conference on Population Development, which we celebrate here today, was held in Cairo in September, and it carried forward resolutions from the previous, including the 1975 Women's Conference, which held that individuals and couples have the right freely and responsibly to determine the number and spacing of their children and have the information to do so. The exercise of this right is basically attainment of is basic to any real attainment of equality between the sexes, without which its achievement, women are disadvantaged in their attempt to benefit from other reforms. It began to hint at the ways in which females' sexual and marital lives are completely embedded with their social and economic both acceptance and their survival. For males, these are separate spheres to a much greater extent, but for females, these decisions are merged. But it didn't get into that very much. It reaffirmed this vision of family planning. It reaffirmed client-centered care and the importance of quality as measured and viewed by the client rather than up to then program effort was often measured in the money spent, the staff trained, the pamphlets produced, but not as received by and held by and longitudinally experienced by clients. What it didn't do was specify the metrics by which this should be measured. So even to this day, we call it family planning, and that's a question. And it's measured often in something called couple years of protection, which is basically, a contraceptive inventory system. So it got that far. It promoted the idea of reproductive health care, a broader spectrum of services, a broader spectrum of technologies. Abortion was a very controversial issue because on the one hand, voluntary abortion was threatened. On the other hand, there were stories of coerced abortion. So abortion was treated only as sort of the issue was unsafe abortion. Al Gore, who led the US delegation, was very sensitive on this subject, he did a lot of good things, I'm not criticizing him, but he did not want abortion to be seen as a family planning method. Now the family, and I think this is where it's extremely important. The family in the ICPD was still treated as if it was a sanctified unit, but this is a vague language. It did not tackle it or inquire into the internal power dynamics inside the family. It began to edge towards seeing how, quote, family and the iconography around it and the economic investment in it was basically controlling females from a very young age. It said, the girl child faced discrimination from before birth. It said, it noted that FGM was harmful, but it did not suggest prohibiting it. It discussed marriage and marriage age, but did not call out child marriage. It was, in that way, it was not aligned with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It mentioned equal opportunity for family members, especially rights of women and children, a little daylight in the way the household was seen as a corporate unit. The family was still treated as a sanctified part of culture, no discussion of economic underpinnings for patriarchy and government. It was very proactive about the importance of females in all political life in geographic areas and arenas down to the community level, and not just national machinery. In the earlier conferences, the idea was that states would set up national machinery and that would fix it. This was more real and more about movements. It mentioned, on behalf of females at least, the need for mentors, local NGOs, power, female leadership in designing and providing services. But there were no real benchmarks for funding such efforts, and there was an acknowledgement there were active attempts by state actors and others to inhibit these NGOs from doing their work. And in this particular meeting, I think we saw a real fruition of cross-national cooperation, and which required in-person conversations and the words I wrote down for the work that we all did was trust, flexibility, serendipity, and persistence. We had that possibility, and as my mentor would have said, social capital, social capital, social capital. The Beijing conference was a lot more radical in a way. It was a year later, and it also underscored the importance of client-centered services. It obviously affirmed very strongly the importance of the reproductive health approach and the notion that the person comes in and says, gee, I have a body. I'd like to delay pregnancy, I'd like to space, or I'd like to permanently end, or I have an infection, or I'm afraid of sexually transmitted diseases, or I'm having trouble having children and want fertility services, or in a larger view of the constellation of services, I'm in a violent relationship. So it was beginning to move towards arenas where, again, services would deal a bit more with power. I think some of its contributions that when I reread yesterday come under, I should mention two more things on the service side. Abortion at least got a call out to look at the determinants of unsafe abortion. I mean, there's something behind this, right? It didn't call for the right to abortion, but let's look at the determinants. And it noted that FGM should be prohibited. I think the most extraordinary contribution made there was the way it began to define violence across the life cycle and drivers of violence. Are we close? 5 minutes, oh, that's fine, I'm good. They say, girls lived with unabated violence from birth forward. Good word, unabated. It suggested protections and care for adolescent girls and young women in abusive relationships. It acknowledged that such existed. It acknowledged much more that there were sexually active females and males that were not in, quote, couples. It rejected the absolutist cultural protections of, quote, religious beliefs, saying that extremist beliefs and practices can actually promote attacks on females' basic rights, that there was an opposition there. That was very new, okay? It suggested that inequality in the family was potentially a driver of violence, fostering and tolerating violence against females, but it didn't, for example, note that things like, female genital mutilation was actually tied to the marriage market, the daughter being unmarriageable if she hadn't basically been mutilated at a young age. And during the ICPD, there had been televised on CNN a barber doing FGM on a young female. There were many mentions of domestic violence, but the benchmark was they named something called marital rape, the idea that females own their bodies inside and outside of marriage, and you could be raped within marriage. That was a very big discussion. There was no discussion, however, about no-fault divorce, how to personal status laws, or mechanisms to escape these abusive relationships. And then, very significantly, it identified that potentially agents of the state sometimes commit acts of violence, such as sexual abuse, forced abortion, and sterilization. Again, getting closer to power. Then at the end, on the economic support of children, it did suggest that, the absent parent, usually the father, should provide child support, but still identified single-headed households, quote unquote, female-headed households, as sometimes something of a broken family, rather than focusing on the rights of children, which I think have been neglected in all these discussions, to be supported by both parents, okay? It was really strong on social capital. It mentioned need for confidential environments, for peer spaces, for local pro-female NGOs to redesign and staff programs, for women's freedom of association, and for cross-national civil society. And that, both within our countries and across our countries, protecting those communication and action channels is essential. And it acknowledged purposeful actions by government to contain and limit the impact of pro-female NGOs. What's done and unexplored? We have taught client-centered care, but the metrics that measure services and drive resources within a human rights framework are still very indistinct, and some of them, I think, inure against both rights and good care. There's still too little discussion of the role of, quote, culture, and particularly this idea of family, and the economic advantages to both males and governments of using the family as a cudgel is really not discussed. And it's not just, quote, patriarchy, but this is the way that governments don't have to support the social sector. There's an economic driver behind this. There is still a fixation on national action to some extent, but we have to look at whether it's the SDGs or others, localizing the goals and getting the money flows closer to Earth in particularly hotspot geographies. And finally, and I think this will resonate politically here in this country now and in many other countries, the shrinking back from humane social sector is the companion piece to now this newly rigidified idealized family. Actors now can name preferred cultural definitions of the following. Who is a real woman? Who is an approved patriotic woman? What is the ideal childbearing family? Who is eligible for state-supported childbearing, including HIV? And what is a welcome child that gets their identity directly and not have to transfer through the limitations of their mother's status? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Oh, I think I'm next.
Oh, you're not, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
yeah.
No, no, not at all.
Yeah.
And who can get an abortion? I'll just add that to your list.
You'll go to right, yes.
Judith, yeah, so I really want to, thank Columbia, thank you, especially to Qingao for hosting us here. Thanks to Jeanette for stepping in, and especially thanks to the Ford Foundation, which has provided some support for us to do something that Judith and I have been talking about for several years, which is to try to memorialize this chapter in history that was so much about the transition of global norms to China in the area of reproductive health and rights that happened around the ICPD conference and the Beijing Women's Conference the following year in 1995, which in some ways was a much more dramatic event because it happened in Beijing and really brought the transnational civil society world working on women's rights to Beijing for the NGO Forum. But I just want to say, where was the world in 1994? Judith has talked a bit about, the Bucharest Conference in 1974, where there was this debate between family planning programs versus development. And then at the ICPD, I think the acknowledgement that both development and family planning programs were important. But in the years after Bucharest, the UNFPA was created as a kind of instrument of the UN system to support countries implementing family planning programs around the world. I ended up in China in 1980 when Deng Xiaoping invited UNFPA to come into China, before the one-child policy was started, and I think without a real full understanding of what was intended, but to come in and help with, the 4 modernizations, which was quadruple the GDP by the year 2000, but not really knowing clearly what the denominator was. So, UNFPA helped with the census, and we helped with a huge demographic training and research project, post-Cultural Revolution, where we actually sent Gu and Feng, to do their PhDs in the United States in the early 1980s. So we've known each other for a really long time. That was our PO1 project. So, I've sort of been watching and involved in all of this for a very long time. I had a little book on called The Billion and Counting that I published in 1982. It was my master's thesis, and that's basically how I ended up as the first international program officer for the newly opened UNFPA office in China as a complete unknown. But following my years, working for 4 years in China in the early 80s on the population program, and as a kind of gateway in for the world through the UNFPA program and to the biggest population in the world and what was going on and trying to support good work in many ways, manufacturing contraceptives, training demographers, doing the census, many other things we were doing. I left China and did my own PhD on the Chinese, looking at the Chinese population program at Harvard at a very critical juncture in time when the world was shifting towards the new ICPD agenda of more reproductive health and rights as part of the population control, moving away from population control and family planning programs per se, to really look at the importance of incorporating reproductive health and women's rights within that larger equation, which was what ICPD and the Beijing Women's Conference were very much about. And Judith was a critical part of that. She and her colleague Anru Jain at the Population Council had created this framework called the Quality of Care Framework for Family Planning Programs, which really shifted the whole paradigm to client-focused services, really looking at the woman, looking at the couple, and looking at the larger context. So I fell into Judith's orbit at that point in time. You know, Harvard was involved in many of the pre-ICPD discussions and Harvard's, the Beijing Women's Conference discussions. So through that and through my own work, I ended up, you know, being in Judith's orbit and working as a consultant to the Population Council, you know, not in China, but in many other places. I met Judith Elsner, who's in the back there, who was with IPPF at that point. We both sat on a working committee at USAID looking at quality of care that Judith sent us to, or certainly sent me to. And I refocused my own doctoral dissertation thesis, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and the champion of family planning program effort, Parker Malden, who was there, who didn't have a reproductive health bone in his body, actually, but was really on the side of like showing that family planning programs were an important part of, you know, of the equation. So I was in this funny position. I refocused my thesis on quality of care. I ended up doing a study in 1989 on the quality of Chinese family planning services. And then I ended up, you know, consulting on a variety of other things for Rockefeller and others on that, and then came back to China for the Ford Foundation in 1996, right after the Beijing Women's Conference, so in a portfolio and a legacy in the Ford Foundation office, which had, you know, as I guess the second program officer there, that was really focused on following up on the Beijing Women's Conference, which Ford was a major actor in supporting the NGO Forum in China, and was also a major actor in supporting the reproductive health shift globally, post ICPD and post the Beijing Women's Conference, through the 14 field offices and the New York program on reproductive health. So it was a network and movement for change, you know, that I was very much in the center of when I, you know, I showed up in 1996, you know, at the Ford office in Beijing. And shortly thereafter, Gu and Zhang Li walked into my office to say, you know, post ICPD, and Gu will talk more about this, post ICPD, China was really looking for a way forward to shift its own the most draconian population policy in the world, family planning program in the world, to a kindler and gentler program, or just to espouse some of the principles of ICPD and try to find a way forward on the birth control program. And Gu and Zhang Li, who was head of the targets, basically, of the State Family Planning Commission, you know, really, you know, spearheaded an effort that we called the Quality of Care Project, which we began working with the State Family Planning Commission. We had 6 pilot counties working around the country to demonstrate a different way of doing business, a much more client-oriented set of services focused on contraceptive choice, certainly not moving away from the targets at that point, which were still part and parcel of the whole thing. We formed a contact group of global experts, including Judith, and we just had a great kind of group of experts on the China side and on the international side, who were very much involved in, you know, in these discussions post ICPD to really try to think through how to move the program forward. And out of that contact group came another initiative, which you'll hear very much about today, which was a bunch of the demographers led by Wang, Feng, and Gu to really pull together a group of many demographers who had been trained in the UNFPA program, the PO1 project, the earlier project, but who were in real positions of power and influence, economists, deans of social policy school, many people. So you have other people who were, you know, pulled in and really started meeting regularly and really trying to pull together the economic and social evidence for why the one-child policy really needed, and the demographic evidence for why the one-child policy really needed to change. And They're going to talk to you a bit about that today. That's very much the basis of, their efforts. And, I think those two projects, the Quality Project and the Population Policy Reform effort, which took until 2013, they should have listened to these guys way earlier, we would not be in the situation we are in China today with the aging population, the huge impact on the sex ratio at birth, and many of the problems that have resulted from the one-child policy sticking around for way too long, and the reluctance to end it. So anyway, I just think that's, you'll hear more about that from these folks. They moved the discussion into the public discourse, China's looming demographic crisis, and did many other things over probably a 10 or 15-year period to really try to mobilize. They made petitions to the State Council, mobilized lots of energy and effort, which took a long time before things really shifted. So think I'll just, try to sum up now and just say that, I think there are many, so after 2001, when I left, the board continued to support the work. Judith Helsner, who's here, who was at the MacArthur Foundation, took over a lot of the funding support for the initiative, and I think it was a really important moment in time and an important part of history to see how these many threads came together from the global movements to work with the China in the very difficult China context to try to really support some of the major themes of how the world was shifting at those points in time. But I think we're in a new moment right now, which is where the shift is not about population control, it's about pro-fertility. We have many countries in the world now that are dealing with below replacement fertility, not the least of which is China. So really the questions that I think are, how much did we really achieve? Does the state really still retain the means of making, women as the vehicle do its bidding on its population control or population goals, right? Which at this point is more kids. As a result of the one-child policy, you have a lot of women speaking with their bodies. They don't want to get married. They don't want to, provide their income to in the retaining, still patriarchal society, their husband's family, and lose control of their own independence. But how is the law, something I've learned a lot from, in the last week or so from Li-Ke and Carl and others, how is the law, working against them in terms of ability to divorce, needing approval for abortion, and things like that. So I think we have some really important topics to discuss here about state control over women's bodies, which was exemplified in the most intensive way possible during the one-child policy over many decades in China, and now is having its new version in the pro-fertility policy. So I'll just stop there and move it over to my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan.
It's always very nice to be back in Columbia. I remember last time I was here, 2013, invited by Jeanette to give a talk here. So it's good to be back. After Judith and Joan, I'm going to report to you how we get out the one-child policy in China. I said it's a long journey. It's a very long, over long. Myself, as Joan said a bit, I was a UN fellow to be sent at that time to study abroad and then back China. And I was served as the advisor for China delegation to ICPD at that time. And I was able, 1994 in New York for the PrepCon for the whole month, to debate about the draft of the program or action. And then moved to Cairo in September for the official conference and NGO forum. And also next year, the Women Conference in Beijing. All these, the message I received from the participation of these events is population issues should not be addressed without due respect to people's, particularly women's, reproductive health and reproductive rights. China should not be no exception. The one-child policy was questioned, as you may know some, from at the beginning. It was proposed in 1980, and the ICPD certainly intensified the debate, both in China and abroad. After ICPD, China started the process to move itself, reoriented the program toward quality care. I would thank Judith. She was the one proposed the concept, quality care, and also the 6 elements for the quality care program. We took this as the guidance for our quality care experiment in China. And the picture was Judith at that time in China, and the bottom it was many international scholars involved, including Judith. Yong was at the right. So during the experiment, birth permit was in China, then removed, and informed choice of contraceptives introduced. And it's a process gradually turning the rights back to the people. And meanwhile, demographically speaking, China has seen its fertility dropped below replacement from the early 1990s. And now we thought this is time to put the number of children on the table. So we put together a team at the beginning of 2000 to call the fertility policy in China in the 21st century. We had a team of people all over the country to work together. And first, we want to ask the question, what was the target of the policy in terms of the fertility it want to achieve? So we call it policy targeted fertility, which is policy fertility. And we also mapped the diversity of fertility policy in terms of the policy fertility over the country, as you see on the map. And we do see the variations in terms of the fertility policy over the country. But after all, you will see more than half of the population under the policy called 1.5 children. And if everyone followed the policy, what will happen in China is that 2/3 of the family will end up with only 1 child. And quantify the policy fertility nationwide together, will have, on average, every family has 1.47, which means every family will have only less than 1.5 children. So based on these studies, we start to draft our petition to the government. And then finally, in 2004, we completed the petition, and with also these people signed individually. And that time, once we submitted our first petition to the government, Madam Feng. She was the one in charge of the family planning program in China in the 1990s, a very long time. And she was also the head of the China delegation to ICPD. So she thought this is a very important issue. She called an internal seminar to discuss our proposal, petition. But the response from the discussion was not so favorable to our petition. Because most people at the conference, at the seminar, thought the low fertility we saw in China was mainly due to the tight policy. If you lose the policy, you will have a higher fertility. It assumes a positive relationship between fertility policy and the fertility level. Now we have to answer if that's true. We also introduced the international perspectives. We worked with East and Western Center and UNPA to head the forum in Honolulu and in Beijing in 2005. Then we start to work on the field at these areas which has 2 children per family policies since the mid-1980s. It has been 2 decades to show if that is true, they are positively related. And when we went to the survey of these areas, we found that's not true. These areas with 2-child policies, fertility below 2, which means not every family has 2 children. And no births reborn, and very few high parity births. And the sex ratio at birth is by and large normal. So based on these field surveys with the evidence, we had the book published called Experiment of 80 million people. Meanwhile, we worked with the Jiangsu local government for 5 years to survey these people if they are going to have 2 children. In Jiangsu, in rural area, more than 70% are single children. And but Jiangsu has a local policy to allow these couple, one side is single, to have 2 children. So these single children, since the proportion is so high, so that the single-sided couple become more so, and they grow up to a marriageable and childbearing age. So for them, they want to see what will happen if more and more women are eligible to have 2 children. What will happen if they want to have 2 children, or if they have 2 children? But for us, we want to answer the policy question if they are positively related. And we went to survey in the field, talk to these women, and we found among these we surveyed more than 4,000 women. They are qualified to have 2 children according to the local policy. But only less than 10% of them have 2 children. And for them, we asked what is the ideal number of children if they want to have 2 children. Only less than half want to have 2 children. But even among them, only 1/5 said that they definitely want 2 children. So ideal number for them is 1 and 4.45. Still very low. And then with all this rich evidence from the field, we thought that's ready to have another petition to the government to argue for urgency. And we had the second forum for the policy issue. And we have some change in our strategy from only focus on policy change to the assessment of the demographic situation, from data analysis only to the experiment documentation, from advocacy among the leaders to the wake-up call to the public, and from national impact to the family well-being. And we had more scholars signed for the second petition to the government. Finally, we saw reform begin, but very partially in 2013. Only allow those couple as one child single to have second child. And it was very much carried out with great caution, because it's surveyed to say 70% of the people want to have 2 children. So they expected some rebound in fertility. But actually, response was very weak. Only 1/6 of the families who are qualified to have the second child apply for second child. So the weak response triggered another debate. So we had a third forum on the policy issues in Shanghai, again with Fudan University and the UNPA, and Madam Feng also attended the whole forum meeting. And as a result of the forum, we had the third petition for policy change. The title was full 2-child policy for every couple rather than some couple, and remove all restrictions, not some restrictions, on childbirth for citizens. Then later on, that was submitted to the top of the government, and the result was in October 2015, the new policy change occurred, allow all the couples to have 2 children. This means declared the official ending of the 35 years long one-child policy in China. But meanwhile, you see, this is another policy called 3-child policy come out in 2021, which means still with the number of children. We had a commentary published in Study of Family Planning with Wang Feng was the first author, and it says China's policy change came at least a decade late than it should have. The costly lesson we learn not only in politics and policy making, but also in how parts of the academic community informed and misinformed public policy making. In 2017, we received why my title was Soft Science Award in China. This is an exception in China because this award is not applied, but nominated. It's not from the government, but from the non-government foundation. It was awarded because it is regarded as the most meaningful social science research at that time by the foundation. After that, as in recent years, you saw that the annual votes all the way down in China since 2000. Yeah, 1 more minute, okay. And 2021, it grows very little, 500,000 for the whole country, and almost barely growing, only 0.3 per thousand. And 2022, growth really turned to negative. and the growth rate too. Negative growth finally arrived in China, no doubt. And the societal concerns growing and call for pro-natalist policies. But the journey is not ended. It is still ongoing. Finally, I want to say, because it's a three-child policy, the restrictions are not entirely gone. And people still want to attribute to have its effect, like this year, second year, people expect the fertility will turn itself back up. And the low fertility trap was regarded as not valid by evidence. The concept of second demographic transition is seen as not necessarily applicable to China. And meanwhile, as Judith mentioned a bit about the abortion issues, when we saw the births become down, abortion remained very high, almost 10 million a year in China now, and mostly unintended and unmarried. So still, we have a lot to work on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciate the invitation, and thank you, for Columbia for hosting us, and for your generous introduction. For Baochang, she's not here, and for everyone attending. I counted as a demographer that in this room, in the audience, about 30-ish people, and 20 are women, and 10. So this world is indeed shifting in many ways, and this is one of the change we are observing. But I'm going to, what I have prepared is what I worked together with Wang Feng. So I'm going to do the presentation, and Wang Feng might, come in with on the commentary side. I'm going to zoom. Let me see. I'm going to start from here. This is UN's new data, and we say the trend is this is the population of China from 1950 all the way to the projection all the way to the end of the century. And China is at a historical moment. This is the first time in Chinese history, I can say with confidence, the population decline was not driven by a mortality crisis. This is much to celebrate. It's much to celebrate. I think this, and the underlying force is the declining fertility. Again, I'm using UN's data. UN's data is not perfect. I will come to here. And you can see China's fertility is now barely above 1, okay? And it came down in, roughly speaking, 3 waves. Right after the famine, that's one big drop. And then the one-child policy came in, did not budget the fertility that much. Then came the second wave in the early 1990s. Then now we are in the third wave. UN is projecting that China's fertility will stay above 1 for the decades to come. But we don't have a crystal ball looking to future. So how did we get here? I think it's an important question, and as a demographer, I want to clear this. And there's actually quite a bit to discuss. First, the Chinese government did not know how low the fertility was for almost 2 decades. In the 1992, there was a so-called 380,000 women survey, that's a fertility survey, and saw a big fertility drop. Nobody believed that number. Okay, the fertility dropped from, roughly speaking, from 2.2 all the way to 1.6. Nobody believed it. And year after year, Chinese government has been surveying the population. As the low line is from its survey. And they adjust it in some way, miraculously, say, hey, fertility is about 1.8-ish, but gradually declining. That's the assumptions they have been working on. Now we have the but now, now coming all the way to about 2010-ish, there was policy adjustment. We see first single-child policy, single-side child policy adjustment, then the two-child policy. We see a small effect, at most, a small effect, and then it's very short-lived. Then there is a collapse since 2020. The data looks somewhat different if we use the census data, because the 2020 census, we can look back, say, hey, what the population census tells us, and UN has, based on the census, made its projection and make the backward projection. And the two lines suggest a somewhat different trajectory. There was a quick decline in the early 1990s. Then there was a gradual increase. So the question is why there was a gradual increase. Was that related to the policy softening, related to the quality of care, or there was some kind of, the measure of TFI is not perfect. It's a period measure. There's a momentum shift because lots of people had their second and third child in the later 1980s, and they don't need to have a second and third child. But then we see that fertility, there was some relaxation effect after 2013-ish, but again, the effect was very small, and again, we see the collapse. So no matter what, we see the collapse. And we see also that there's a good parallel. It's roughly speaking 30-year difference between the collapse in the early 1990s and early 2020s. And in some way, demographers and sociologists, we call this is a generational shift or cohort replacement. And if we use this data to project what's going to happen in the future, we actually don't know what to project because we are at a historical turning point. What we can tell from the survey data, one thing is remarkable is that, so the one-child policy has been the normal. The assumption has been that everyone wants to get married in China, universal marriage, and everyone wants to have children. Government restricts. But there's a major shift around 2008, 2010-ish, that China's so-called TF1, this is again, it's a not perfect measure. There's a number of women, if we project according to the pattern, the TFR1 the proportion of women having the first child, now it has dropped from 1, almost universal, to 60%. So the implication would be, roughly speaking, 40% according to current fertility schedule, not having kids. That's unthinkable in the Chinese culture. So the question is, what's going on? Part of the answer is we say the shift in marriage. Okay, the proportion of Chinese in the 1982 census, every woman by age 30 were married or already having kids. Now, if we look at the proportion of never married, this is like skyrocketing, and across the nation, it's by age 30, it's already close to 15%. If we look at those with college education, it's at 25%. And importantly, education is measuring. It's a very good predictor of fertility. If you have college education, fertility is about 1.2, 1.3, no more than. And the variation, there's no variation. No matter. The other part is urbanization. If you're living in the urban area, everyone having very small number of kids. And we see some kind of international convergence. China is certainly not alone, and in terms of proportion of people never married, China is even still quite behind Japan and South Korea. Those are the neighbors, probably 20 years, or 50 years ahead of China in terms of demographic transition. So the question is, a sociological question, is say, hey, why are people giving up marriage? Oh, they are just delaying. And the question, and the other side is why they are giving up. And New York Times, Li Yuan had, she had a very good story. There's a social norm constructed: no job, no marriage, no kids. There are lots of. There's a curse at age 35, but women are not budging against this culture. Say, hey, I rather stay single, rather not get married, but I want to keep my freedom. And all the discussion, there's a change of attitude, there's a gender inequality, there's a high cost of living, high house cost, all those things, there's plenty of discussion around that. This, again, China is not alone in this. And all the governments are responding to this, and they come out with all kinds of policies. And Japan has parental leave laws, emergency 5-year plan. They try to provide service, encourage women to having kids, and try to make the work-life balance, work-family life balance a little bit more, a little bit easier. Similar thing has happened in South Korea. The sad side, or maybe I don't know how to characterize it, Japan's fertility has been below replacement for over half a century. Yes, it's not the highest in the East Asian country, but it's about 1.4-ish. South Korea, with all the great effort, nothing is budging. They are even going further down. It's right now, it's 0.8-ish, or even lower than that, I think always. Yeah, China shift, the policy change, and we say if there were any effect, they were short-lived. And they are now saying we want to build a so-called birth-friendly society. This is fresh off the press. It came out, exactly a month ago. A new directive from the State Council issued on October 19th. There were 13 targeted measures to enhance childbirth support service, expand child care system, strengthen support in education, housing, employment, and all those things. All those sounds great. All those things sounds great. And if there were any country can make the policy together, make it more comprehensive, it would be China. Okay, so here another off the plate, and this is coming out just this week. Okay, I want to highlight two things. One is first, she said we need to affirm the correctness and effectiveness of birth planning policy. So history basically say, hey, we did it right, and our reform was also right as well. Okay, the second point I want to highlight is he emphasized, hey, we should emphasize more on the guidance, providing service, and instead of control. That sounds all great. But last sentence here, local party and government leaders should take responsibility. That sounds so familiar. I don't know how to characterize it. Put the old wine in the new bottle, or put the new bottle in the old, new wine in the old bottle. And I want to remind everyone the comparison. There's an unmistakable parallel in the making of the one-child policy and the scrapping of the one-child policy. There's new leadership change at the time. The discussion was, yes, the policy was, the population was viewed as a vehicle, whether it's controlling it or whether try to encourage the birth. And it's mostly for the economic purpose. Try to say, hey, solve the shortage problem or solve the slowdown problem. Or, we say the global discussion, the global environment is also very different. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, everyone was concerned about population explosion. Population bomb was, the catchphrase. Now everyone's talking about aging, low fertility trap, and social security crisis, those kind of discussion. And we say the policy goals, say they try to have the short-term goals and long-term goals, but we say the effect. In the 1980s, there was little effect. Okay, in the 1980s, the fertility did not budge that much. But we know part of the current low fertility in terms of cultural shift, that's probably buried. So Chinese culture around childbearing is so rational. And even marriage is so rational. There's a calculation. It's all about the cost-benefit calculation. It's right there. And we see similar things, that in terms of encourage policy, the fertility encouragement policy. People, if I'm have to make the projection into the future, we already say the short-term effect is relatively speaking small. Longer-term effect probably is not going to be much, because if you are going to just pay people, a little bit of money to in exchange to have more kids, I don't think any rational people is going to do that. So I want to conclude, coming back to bring back the ICPD 9. I think there are two important perspectives. One is women's right. This is the fundamentally childbearing. Is I think the discussion, global discussion, what the ICPD brought into China was this woman-centered perspective. But in China, this tradition is so strong. This is national state, state approach. The purpose, remember the one-child policy was we make the decision to, have a temporary collective sacrifice for the goal of, economic development. And similarly, discussion is already ongoing that having more children for the sake of our national glory. It's already there. And there's, this is not, China is not alone. Similar nationalistic discussion is happening in the United States. Okay, and in Japan, in other countries as well. So, and we are now in a very different world. In the 1990s, when ICPD 9 introduced, get into China, that China in many ways embraced the world. The idea that China can learn a lot from the world, and world encouraged China, welcome China to be part of this global village. But we now in a very much, different world. The women's reproductive rights is under attack, both in United States, in other parts of the world, and in China, for example, as we mentioned, abortion it used to be very much encouraged. Now the government is already putting some kind of barrier onto it. In terms of reproductive, other kind of service, we already see what's, the writing on the wall. We have not seen things putting on the paper in terms of exactly policy, but we're already seeing that. So on one hand, I try to be optimistic, just like saying in this room, we have more women participating, and we are trying to make a contribution for a better world. At the same time, there's a warning signs. There are warning signs everywhere. That's my comments. Thank you.
So Professor Feng, would you like to add any comments?
I'm okay.
You're okay?
Just waiting.
All right, so this is an incredible opportunity for this panel to address any comments or questions that you might have. And I'm sure there are questions that emerge for you as you listen to their very excellent presentations. So let's see if there are any questions in the audience. There's one online. Okay. So one of the, oh, please, yeah. Take the mic.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentations. My name's Lucy. I graduated from Columbia a few years ago, but has been working at UNFPA since. And I primarily work on advocating for sexual and reproductive rights in the intergovernmental space at the UN. And from my observation, especially during the negotiations, China is not the most vocal member states to support sexual and reproductive rights and women's rights, and but they're not necessarily against it. And as Professor Tsai kind of spoke on, do you have any further insights on why this is the position of China? And to a more broader questions, as you said, there are more attacks on SRH in general that we see in the global trend today. And how do you foresee China to position itself in this bigger context?
Should I try?
Please.
Yeah. So obviously, I don't work for Chinese government or don't even work with the Chinese government in any capacity. So all what I can say is speculating. I think that there is always a suspicion from the Chinese government side. They are suspicious of the NGOs, but the political climate make it even more prominent that they don't, they are suspicious of the international side and NGO side. So whatever the social side, the government control is indeed the probably most important goal to keep the society under its control. So I think that's probably why it's not, coming out, actively participating. I think Yong and others.
Yeah, I would say, unlike the 90s, the situation for women's rights in China is really much more constrained these days. There's much more government pushback on rights in general. women's rights in particular, or as part of that. So, it's not an easy conversation or an easy, the advocates for that are careful. The work may still exist to some degree, probably much more so through government than any non-governmental organizations, but it's not the most hospitable climate for rights in general. So I don't think you're going to see anybody advocating for that at the global level, frankly, because many of the voices who were advocating for that involved in, Committee on the Status of Women and other UN global convenings, are not, they don't have the platform anymore, or and aren't frequently part of the delegations or the representation to global negotiations on any of those issues. And I think the larger context, of course, is that we're looking, I think your last slide was really brilliant in really looking at, government control over reproduction in women's bodies. It's still a state project. It's a government in China feels entitled to, the control over women's bodies in a way, and on behalf of what are considered state goals, fertility, they're reducing fertility during the very draconian one-child policy without any respect to women's rights, certainly in the implementation of the policy in the early days. Now we're moving to a situation of pro-fertility where the government, as you said, the policy still exists, right? And it's now with a pro-fertility element. And who controls women's bodies, I think, is the major question here in the room, right, going forward, so.
Yeah, so if I may join in this discussion, this is a great question. Two thoughts. One is, as Cai Yong said at the end, the question is whether, I can't say whether the Chinese government has learned anything from the one-child policy. I think the message is it's not. They're still using population as a means to achieve other goals. And we are a bit nostalgic. We can do this quite often. Before the current administration, Xi Jinping's leadership, there was this phrase called 以人为本, actually treating people as the foundation. And now is 中国梦, is China dream. So that's very different, right? It's this going back to the full modernization. That's how the one-child policy was kind of launched, right? And now this effort to promote 3 children, and the irony is they still have a policy. You cannot have, a more than 3, even though I don't know people whether they pay attention to this limit or not. But the state still thinks that it has some right to control people's bodies and then to use population as a means for the nation state goals. So that's one point. The other is what you noticed is China is not the most hospitable, but at the same time, it's not the most hostile country. Well, for anyone who has lived or brought up in China, one of the challenges you face in childhood is you learn all these great ideas about communism, socialism, and then later on you realize the country you live in is a capitalist society run by a communist party. So there's always this embarrassing contradiction in the country, and then for people who are grown up in the society, you learn how to unlearn what you were taught from the very early age. So I think in the international stage, that embarrassment is always there. So that's why the state does not say we're not supporting gender equality. And so you have to look at not just the words, the ideology, the ideological foundation for the legitimacy against reality. And both for the social protests at the end of COVID and also the massive online discussion following this woman being chained, had how many children? It was the outpouring of protests, the faces during the protests are all young women. So you clearly see at the top of the country, I mean, society, political structure, there's another single member in the Politburo. And then at the bottom, Tsai Ing showed you the rapid increase in education and women giving up all these, constraints. So the society is really moving in that direction, but the state, has not, I think, changed that much.
I'm going to say, Judith, we'd welcome your comments, and before you do, I would propose that one of the things that we are actually seeing is governance by contradiction and paradox worldwide.
It's on. Is it okay? Well, this is a really good question. I can't answer specifically for China, but I do think we should look at the human rights movement for a moment. Human rights, everybody has, they're indivisible, and they're expanding. And it is not a resource allocation tool. So you can get away with saying, we affirm this right. But in this case, by not looking at, in effect, what if they said, what if the policy was, anyone who'd like to have a child, and directly give the child rights. I mean, in France, for example, children are registered. They have had low fertility a long time, and they're given identity cards. In lots of countries, they're registered, but identity cards come later. Example, Bangladesh, you can't take an exam without an identity card, and that means you have to revert to, your father's signature, et cetera, et cetera. They haven't really freed reproduction if there's an intention to support a new human. And the economic interest, what is the purpose of the economy? What I see globally is that they're asking females through the guise of patriotic family structures or whatever to raise the tax base and then have somebody else spend the money. I mean, and one of the calculations that does not appear in any of these papers, we've had the data for a long time, since 1990, which show that $1 in a woman's hand is worth 20 in a man's hand in terms of reinvestment in the next generation. The economic arguments are not made, but they're central. In the case of Sierra Leone, a few years ago, they were going to ban pregnant girls from going back to school, and we sort of modeled, what if you really did that in terms of the income available to children to live, because more than 75% of females in Sierra Leone will be solely responsible for themselves and younger and perhaps older dependents. And you saw a fourfold difference. This is my back of the envelope, so nobody published this. But in any case, when we wrote the minister, we didn't begin with rights. We began with, you've just planned poverty. That was the beginning, because it's never put in that frame. This is an intentional, women's sexuality, fertility, and labor are transferred from one family to another. That's what's going on. And then it is used, and the proceeds of that, they have no control over. And that the economic, the family as the arena in which equality is actually crafted and consolidated is not addressed.
Hi, thanks to all the panelists for coming to the informative talk. I'm a graduate student here. I went to Chicago studying econ. I went to this talk by this British historian Niall Ferguson, and then on population. And he had this statement that we are heading towards extinction because we chose it. And due to a few factors, the global decrease in sperm count, abortion, and dating apps, how that makes people basically have less sex. I was just wondering to hear all of your opinion on that assessment.
You want to say something, Joan? Yeah.
I think it's more in your area, Wang. Are we moving towards? I mean, I would always take what Niall Ferguson says with a grain of salt, but he's a brilliant person. And on the sperm count issue, yeah, it's probably true, but I'm not. I think it's I would let you talk from a larger global demographic point of view. I mean, I think there are a lot of people in a lot of places that are still having a lot of kids.
I think and the world is going in the circle. 40 years ago, we actually thought the world was going to not population extinction, but growing with standing room only. So 40 years ago, we thought population explosion is going to continue forever. And now we're looking at population decline. So I think the essence is we don't know what's going to happen. And number one. Number two, it's the world, even with the population decline, I don't know to what speed. One estimate is that China is going to have only less than half of its population by the end of this century. But I think societies always have a way to adapt, to innovate. For instance, I'm not praising the fossil fuel field, but we've been talking about the exhaustion of fossil fuel for decades, and now we have not only more fossil fuel, we have solar energy and all that stuff. I think human societies would know how to adapt even with that scenario. The last point is very important, is that I have not read Neil Ferguson's piece, but a lot of this stuff from including the Chinese government is really retraining the gunpowder to women's bodies, right? And then without thinking, why can we make the society more gender equal, more friendly? It's very clear, without thinking of the other factors, women pay a lot more sacrifices and costs when they have children, right? So why don't we do something like that instead of giving people money or having political campaigns? So I think the essence is the box is much larger. We can think about how to make the society more friendly, gender friendly, so people can achieve what they want. And the other part is, I think human beings have the ability to adapt. So instead of spreading out these alarmist messages, which we've seen before, right? I think we can look elsewhere.
Go ahead, Judith.
At the very bad, all technologies. At the very beginning, I mentioned that the original statement about why population was even a subject was in relation to resources. And I think I don't think fertility should have ever been a subject. I think it's dependency burden. And in the Beijing conference, they actually talk about the dependency ratio, dependency burden on the earth, and the dependency burden actually in the unit which determines your survival, which is within this household unit. It's, pain is, human rights may be indivisible, but pain is not. Someone has it, another person doesn't. So my own feeling is that the conversation should move to subnational, first of all. I sort of think countries are not serving people that well. And the SDGs, for example, should be articulated at a subnational level, and the resources should flow, and they should go priority basis, those places, kind of a process standard that have the highest concentration of those at the greatest risk of the youngest ages, right? And that's a cross-national alliance of like situated. In both of the documents I discussed, the indigenous population is called out. Obviously, there are many other populations, but national governments are certainly in general not representing the needs of sometimes the majority of their population, significant subpopulations. And the issue of consumption needs to be addressed because it's, the fertility of Americans is a lot more damaging than the fertility of some other people. We use 25% of the world's resources. So dependency burden on the earth and its resources, who generates the burdens, who carries the risk, the resulting risk. And at the level of whatever you consider the survival unit, the household, and I do think the surrounding communities are important, who again generates the burden, who carries the risk. Adjusting those, I think, meets the idea of in a more equitable world, and at the right level of system.
So let me perhaps add to your comments and help in summarizing and concluding the session we had today. So my good friend Feng mentioned that there really are shifts that are essential for women to be able to experience the human rights that they purportedly have. If you look at the World Economic Forum and the OECD data on gender parity, gender equity, one of the things that they say is that one of the measures that can be used is to see how many women are actually represented in government. And it's astonishing how actually the countries in this world have very few women leaders. So simplistic as it may be, I always think that it's really difficult for male leaders to define, frame, shape, give substance to policies that pertain to women who have entirely different experiences. So to bring this to close, what I would say to you is that all of the panelists have been very forthright in sharing both the context as well as the implications for the future. And one thing that is a good takeaway is stay tuned, because we're not sure how this is all going to work out. We've gone from no child policy to one child policy to two child policy to three child policy. And interestingly, what is occurring in China on an enormous scale is, as Yong mentioned, happening in other countries around the world. So one of the conclusions I don't want you to take away is that education is not a good thing for women. It actually is a very good thing. And I think we have to see some shifts in the political composition of governments around the world. So would you join me in thanking all of the panelists? And I also do want to thank once again the Columbia Population Research Center, the Weatherhead Institute, and also the person who's really missing, who should be here, the Columbia China Center's incredible founding director, Gao. So thank you all for coming today.